Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Urvashi Sharma, Associate Professor, Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Jagannath University, Jaipur. In today's session, we'll know more about the early newspapers in England and America. How things progressed, as we have seen in the earlier session also, the earlier people or the rulers or the official used town criers to send across their message to the people spread in the villages, towns, and cities. This led to the evolution of language in which the government officials played a very important role. As it increased literacy, people were now able to read and write. And but however, dissemination of news and information through written, say handwritten newsletters or handwritten say documents was very difficult and challenging. Then we had Johannes Gutenberg, who invented printing press, which was a revolution in terms of mass communication, as more and more say information could now be printed on a large number of copies could be made and disseminated to the people, and it had no say drawbacks as to the legibility of the handwriting was concerned, because it was printed and not handwritten. Now let us look at the early newspapers in England and America. Which was the first newspaper to be published in the world? It is very difficult to point out a single newspaper as the first one. During the Maurya period, kings used to circulate news to the people as proclamations. In ancient Rome, acta diurna or government announcements were published regularly. They were inscribed in a metal or a stone cubes, and these were placed at the public places. These can be considered as the earliest forms of newspaper. In China also, the government produced such news sheets which they called tipayo. Now let us look at the ancient method of news distribution. As we discussed earlier, tipayo was a say bulletin in the earliest form which was printed on news sheet in China. Right? It was created as early as 202 BC, and it was distributed by the government, and it basically targeted bureaucrats so that they could know what the government was planning. They could know about the policies of the government. Right? It was not for public consumption, but it was for the bureaucrats to know about the day to day functioning of the government. Right? And these were known as the palace reports or the imperial bulletins. Any news for public consumption might have been distributed via posted announcements, basically the forerunners of the modern day posters. Alright. Then we move to Europe, where acta diurna is considered one of the ancient methods of news distribution. What was acta diurna? These were daily gazettes or the news sheets which were created by the government, and it contained information for the public. Political news, military campaigns, trials, executions, all were mentioned in this. They were published in ancient Rome prior to 59 BC, as early as 131 BC. They were the first first they were put on stone or metal sheets, and later they were handwritten and distributed in public forums, so that they could read and scroll or read by the town criers. Acta diurna is often considered as a precursor to the modern day newspaper. It is interesting to note that both ancient Romans and Chinese had the system of news distribution, even though they were ancient civilization, right? They understood the early forms of news media, but they did not qualify to be the newspapers because they were not mass distributed, right? Tipayo was basically for the bureaucrats, whereas Acta Daruna was placed at the public places so that people could come, have a look if they were interested in, or they were actually read aloud by the town criers. Many researchers considered the Peking Gazette, which is published from China, as the first newspaper. It was started in 618. In the initial stages, this newspaper was handwritten and distributed to readers. Later, it was printed and circulating. The Peking Gazette continued its publication till the beginning of the 20th century. Newsletter circulated by the rulers were the first form of newspapers. In India, East India Company circulated such newsletters. Now, according to the World Association of Newspaper, the first newspaper in the modern sense was published by John and Claris in 1605. The name of the newspaper is bit wrong. It is a relation Aller, Furman and Gwendolen Hysterin. We call it relation, right, to be very precise. In 1609, another newspaper was started from Germany, which was called File. Yet another paper in the modern concept was published from Venice, which was called the Gazette. But many such earlier newspapers could not survive for long. The rulers were not happy with these publications, as some of them started criticizing their rule. So many newspapers were forced to close down. In America, a newspaper, the public occurrences lasted only for a day. Similar was the fate of the daily paper started by James Archer in UK. Newspaper underwent a lot of changes in their form and content after that. In England, the Weekly News was launched in 1622. The British newspapers. The British press made its debut, an inauspicious one, in the early 17th century. The news coverage was restricted to foreign affairs for a very long time, and even the first so-called English newspaper was a translation of the Nathaniel Butter, a printer of a Dutch Coranto called Corante, or a news from Italy, Germany, Hungary, Spain, France, and dated September 24, 1621. Together with the two London stationers, Nicholas Bourne and Thomas Archer, Butter published a stream of carantos and avisos, which means in French warnings or announcements, including a numbered and dated series of the weekly news beginning in 1622. News and headlines increasingly replaced the old title page. The English Civil War, which lasted, say, till 1651, from 1642 to 1641, acted as a stimulus to the reporters and publishers, and 300 distinct news publications were brought out between 1640 and 1660. Although many of these were only occasional reports from the battlefront, such as Truth from the York or News from Hull. Some contemporary publications using words such as intelligencer, scout, spy, or post in their names reflected the velocity of the times. But the less politicized word mercury still abounded on many newspaper mastheads, including those of propaganda, such as Mercurius Academicus Royalist and Mercurius Britannicus Parliamentarian. The parliamentarian victory brought strict control of the press from 1649 to 1658, and restored monarchy was even more absolute, with the press being restricted to just two official papers. During the period of Licensing Act from 1662 to 94, an official surveyor of the press was given the sole privilege to publish newspaper. The first newspaper in the modern concept was published in Oxford in 1655. It was the Oxford Gazette. The first newspaper to be published from London was the Daily Courant. It was edited by E. Mollett. In 1784, John Walter launched the Daily Universal Register from London, which later adopted a new name, the Times, as it is known as one of the greatest newspapers in the world. It is developed, the British press would remain principally a national one centred on Fleet Street in London. Appearingly briefly was Lloyd's News 1696, issuing from Edward Lloyd's coffee house, which had become a centre of marine insurance. The subsequent Lloyd's List and Shipping Gazette from 1734, with its combination of general and shipping news, exemplified both the importance of the City of London's financial activities to the newspaper and the importance of reliable and regular financial press to business. Typical of the news breed of English papers was the Daily Advertiser, 1730 to 1807, which offered advertising space along with news of a political, commercial, and social nature. An important gap in the political pages was filled from 1771, when the right to publish proceedings in the Parliament had been granted. This right was not won lightly, for illicit accounts of debates in the House had appeared in the Monthly Political State of Great Britain, 1711 to 40, and every effort had been made to stop them. But campaigners such as the political reformer John Wilkes with the Northern Britain 1762 eventually won out. Politicians of both the Whig and Tory sympathies ran their own often circulars newspaper or simply bribed journalists with occasional handouts and annual stipends. But later in the century, there emerged a more sophisticated reader who demanded and received an independent viewpoint. The eminent newspaper of the time included the Morning Post (1772), the Times from 1788, but started as the Daily Universal Register in 1785, and the Observer in 1791. Censorship continued in the guise of frequent libel prosecutions, and as late as 1810 the radical political essayist William Cobbett was imprisoned and fined for denouncing flogging in the army. But the principle of free press, at least in the peacetime condition, had been firmly established. Now let us look at the American paper. The history of newspaper in America begins in 1619, at roughly the same time as the tradition began in England, and a few decades after the notion of publicly distributed summary of news began in the Netherlands and Germany. In England, the Weekly News, written by Thomas Archer and Nicholas Bourne and published by Nathan Butter, was a collection of news items printed in the quarto format and distributed to their clients wealthy English landowners who lived in London for 4 or 5 months out of a year and spent the rest of the time in the country and needed to be kept up to date with what was happening around. The first American newspapers, 1619 to 1780s. The first regularly produced paper was Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. It was published by Benjamin Harris in 1673 and lasted up to 1716 in Boston on September 25, 1690. The governor of Manchester's Bay Colony did not approve of the opinions expressed by Harris, and it was quickly shut down. In the late 17th and early 18th century, notices of current events or public opinions were handwritten and posted in public taverns and local churches. Who subscribed to gazettes from Europe or from other colonies such as the Plain Dealer posted by Matthew Potter's Bar in Bridgeton, New Jersey. In churches, the news was read from the pulpit and posted on church walls. Another common news outlet was Public Crier. After Harris' suppression, it would not be until 1704 that Boston's postmaster, John Campbell, found himself employing the printing press to publicly publish his news of the day. The Boston Newsletter appeared on April 24, 1707. It was published continuously under different names and editors for 72 years, with its last known issue published on 22nd February 1776. The partisan era, which lasted from 1780s to 1830s. In the early years of the United States, newspaper tended to have small circulation for several reasons. As the printing was slow and tedious, so for technical reasons, no one publisher could generate enormous number of copies or issues. The price of the newspaper tended to exclude many common people. And while Americans tended to be literate, there simply weren't at large numbers of readers that would come later in the century. Despite all that, newspapers were felt to have profound influence on the early years of the federal government. The main reason was that the newspapers were often the organs of political factions, with articles and essays essentially making the cases for public action. Some politicians were known to be connected with specific newspaper. For instance, Alexander Hamilton was a founder of the New York Post. The rise of city newspapers starting from 1830s to 1850s. In the 1830s, newspapers transformed into publications devoted more to news of current events than outright partisanship. As printing technology allowed faster printing, newspapers could expand beyond the tradition of four-page folio. And to fill the newer eighth page, newspaper content expanded beyond the letters from travelers and political essays to more reporting. A major invention of the 1830s was simply lowering the price of a newspaper. When most daily newspapers cost a few cents, working people and especially new immigrants tended not to buy them. But an enterprising New York City printer, Benjamin Day, began publishing newspaper The Sun for a penny. Suddenly, anyone could afford a newspaper. Reading the paper every morning became the routine in many parts of America, and this led to the development of penny press as we call it today. And the newspaper industry got a huge boost from technology when the telegraph began to be used in mid 1840s. The era of great editors, the 1850s. By the 1850s, the American newspaper industry came to be dominated by legendary editors who battled for supremacy in New York, including Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald, William Cullen Bryant of the New York Evening Post. In 1851, an editor who had worked for Greeley, Henry J. Raymond, began publishing the New York Times, which was seen as an upstart without any strong political direction. In 1850 was a critical decade in American history. The major cities and many large towns began to boast of high quality newspapers. The rising politician Abraham Lincoln recognized the value of newspaper. When he came to New York City to deliver his address at the Cooper Union in early 1860, he knew the speech could put him on the road to the White House, and he made sure that his words got into the newspaper, even reportedly visiting the office of the New York Tribune after delivering his speech. Thank you.